All right, let's jump right into this topic. It's a big topic. It's a complicated one. Over the last several weeks, I've gotten a ton of emails from you guys, calls with people asking or suggesting maybe if you are unvaccinated and you get very sick with COVID and you go to the hospital, you should be refused treatment. And of course, that's not going to happen in any real way. There are primary care doctors that are saying our practice will only treat, will only have on our roster vaccinated patients. But if you go to an emergency room, you are not going to be denied treatment because you are unvaccinated, for better or worse, ethical, unethical. That's just not going to happen. But there are now new questions. It's a much more narrow discussion. And the discussion is whether it would be fair to treat vaccinated COVID patients first. And this is more of a triage conversation. So really, it's a question of whether vaccination status should or could be considered in terms of triage. And there's some pretty good arguments to suggest that it should. Which we are going to get into. Interesting Wired article which asks, would it be fair to treat vaccinated COVID patients first? Last week, Texas healthcare policymakers discussed taking vaccination status into account for COVID triage. It's a larger conversation ethicists are bracing for. It's no accident that people describe something that's calculated, cold, and unemotional as clinical. Taking care of people's health isn't emotion free by any means, but the clinic is where physicians and nurses have to make life and death decisions under time pressure, including which patients go first and what kind of care they get. When resources like, say, ventilators or intensive care beds, oxygen, staff, and time are scarce, that decision making is called triage. And last week, the Dallas Morning News reported that some Texas hospitals were considering a massive change to how they do it. The question in play, would it make sense to take into account the vaccination status of their COVID patients? With ICUs filling up with severely ill COVID patients and a shortage of beds and nurses, should clinicians, all other things being equal, that's an important part of it, care for vaccinated people before or differently than unvaccinated ones? And the article goes on to say, it hasn't happened and probably won't. The idea came from a memo. This is a very complicated question. Fundamentally, this is not about ignoring the Hippocratic Oath and saying, don't treat unvaccinated patients. They haven't taken care of themselves, assuming there's no real medical reason why they're unvaccinated. We're going to ignore these people. That's not what this is about. This is about including vaccination status as part of triage, where someone may end up getting less care or might end up getting no care, depending on how full an emergency room is. In a moment, I'll tell you about 3 emergency rooms that are so full they've closed, and whether the vaccination status affects chance of recovery. And you could, on this basis, say, all right, you've got a 65-year-old vaccinated patient and a 60-year-old unvaccinated patient. And if you don't consider vaccination status, you might just go by how severe are their symptoms, their age, etc. If you consider vaccination status, you would have this statistical framework in which you know that hospitalized vaccinated patients are more likely to survive than unvaccinated patients. That would be a way to empirically, not in some kind of moralistic punishment way, but empirically consider vaccination status in triage. Is a vaccinated 50-year-old more likely to recover than an unvaccinated 40-year-old? And there's even another aspect of this, which is if you have a patient in the ER or in the ICU or potentially going into the ICU, and they're unvaccinated, and they're unvaccinated for no other reason other than they fell for conspiracy theories, does it stand to reason that they may generally be less likely to heed the advice that they are given in that hospital if granted an intensive care unit? Would it be fair to consider that as well? And of course, there's the important inclusion of the idea all else being equal. And really, I think the gist here is not to make unclear triage calls about a vaccinated 55-year-old and an unvaccinated 40-year-old, but really more about situations where it's almost identical situations. You might have 2 people equally sick, same age, one vaccinated, one unvaccinated, and you have one spot in the ICU, would it be fair to say we're going to take the vaccinated patient because statistically they're more likely to recover? And in general, they are probably more likely to heed our advice. This is not unheard of elsewhere on the basis of different sort of health considerations. Alcoholics historically have been considered unsuitable for liver transplants because of the presumed high risk of relapsing to excessive drinking, which could ruin the transplanted liver. That's a lifestyle choice that is factored into organ donation, although there are people who rightly say, well, it's not really a lifestyle choice. Alcoholism is a disease. And then it becomes more complex. But the point is that it's similar. It's analogous to some degree. Triage is about chances of survival, but it's also about available resources. It's also about patient willingness to comply with medical advice. And people who are vaccinated are not only more likely to survive, they've shown a motivation to follow the widely accepted medical advice. And ultimately, this is about available resources. And we've talked before, and I'm going to give you an example in the next story of this. When you have a full ICU with disproportionately unvaccinated people, not because of a medical condition that says don't get vaccinated, but because they've chosen not to get vaccinated. If you get into a car accident, if you have a heart attack, if you have a work injury, and you're vaccinated and you go in for something serious not related to COVID, you may not be able to get the treatment you need because of people who have simply chosen not to get vaccinated. And so there is an element of this, which is that people who are not looking out for society are consuming resources and hurting other people. People who maybe would survive after that car crash if they could get right into an ICU, but the ICU is full because of unvaccinated people. So I think it's completely reasonable to take it into account in triage. I'm not saying you don't provide treatment, but the question about triage considerations seems completely logical to me. One of our sponsors is privacy.com. They're giving you $5 when you sign up for their completely free service at privacy.com/Pacman. I've been using Privacy for a little over a year now. You've heard me talk about it before. It's a lifesaver, and here's how it works. It takes just a couple of minutes to set up. Anytime you buy something online or on the phone, instead of actually using your real credit card number, the Privacy app and the browser plugin let you give each company a randomized virtual credit card number that you create out of thin air. It'll even autofill the card number with one click. And the payment is taken out of your checking account without the merchant ever knowing your real information. So this allows you to keep your banking information secure, but also to take control of your finances. You can create up to 12 of these virtual credit cards a month. You can set spending limits. You can freeze them. You can delete them anytime you want. So when you do this, it means you're not going to be charged when you don't want to be, because you can destroy the virtual card number right after using it, which, for instance, I love using free trials because I know I won't be charged when the trial is over if I use a virtual credit card number. You're keeping your identity private by not telling companies who you are. You're keeping your bank or credit card info protected against data breaches and identity theft, and it's free. And like I said, you'll get $5 to spend when you sign up at privacy.com/Pacman.